Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ethan Katz. I teach in the history department, and I am also the Helen Diller Family Faculty Director of the Center for Jewish Studies. It's my great pleasure to just kick off this event. We are so delighted to host Bruno Chaouat on campus. I first met Bruno longer ago than either one of us probably want to admit, in Jerusalem, at a conference on Jean-Paul Sartre and the Jewish question, the 70th anniversary of its publication. And I was really just delighted to hear him speak and learn from him and spend some time with him. And so when we talked about our programming for this year, and we were trying to have a range of perspectives on Jews and critical theory, I thought of him right away, and so glad that he could join us and speaking on topics that couldn't be more on point, perhaps unfortunately, for our current time. Just want to, for those who are not typically at our events, we have an incredibly full roster of events. I think we have 20 events that we're sponsoring or co-sponsoring this semester through the CJS, and we're really very happy to be able to partner with numerous departments. For today's event, we're really delighted to have co-sponsorship from both French and from rhetoric. We appreciate those opportunities for collaboration. And I'm delighted to turn things over in just a moment to my colleague Susan Maslin in the French department. It's been our wonderful good fortune at the CJS to have Susan join us the last couple of years, coinciding with when I started as director. I was just so happy to discover Susan's interest in Jewish studies, and she's become a really important and now set to become a core member of our faculty as we transition to becoming what's called a new initiative center, which will give CJS a new level of clout and presence on campus. So Susan is a scholar of the French Enlightenment, human rights in the Enlightenment, and has a book that she's already done a lot of work on in waiting on Jewish literature, representations of Jews in French literature in the Enlightenment. She seemed like a perfect person to introduce Bruno. So I'm going to turn things over to her, and thank you all so much for coming.
Just walk it.
Just to confirm. Thank you so much for that very fulsome introduction to the introduction. And it's really just so wonderful to see you here today. I know everyone is unbelievably busy right now, but I think it's so worth our time to hear from Professor Chaouat. It's such a treat and a pleasure to welcome you for the very first time. I just learned to Berkeley, so thank goodness, and let's hope there'll be a return visit soon. So I was going to just simply say that it's an honor and a great pleasure to welcome Bruno Chaouat to Berkeley and to introduce him here to you today. Many of you perhaps already know him. He is a distinguished professor of French and of Jewish studies at the University of Minnesota, as well as the Chevalier de l'Ordre des Palmes Académiques, a deeply learned and prolific author. He writes on literature as well as philosophy, as well as theory. He has written on, am I echoing? On romantic author Chateaubriand, which I find so impressive, having attempted to teach Chateaubriand, no mean feat, as well as on a wide range of 20th century literary figures, often from the World War II and post-World War II period. He writes on testimony and Holocaust literature, as well as on theory and philosophy. Perhaps, I'm not exactly sure what you're going to speak to us about today, but perhaps most relevant, I could be proven wrong easily, for us today is his 2021 book, Is Theory Good for the Jews? Which, as you can imagine from the provocative title, is a deeply incisive and really beautifully argued book in which he reflects on resurgent and transformed resurgent anti-Semitism and reflects specifically on how theory may be seen to have turned away from or even to have forgotten some of its fundamental insights, specifically insights rejecting binary thinking and rejecting the masquerading of moralizing as criticism. Obviously, when the book came out in 2021, we didn't know where we'd find ourselves, but it seems to me a book that is very, very helpful to us today in thinking about some of the thorny issues that we confront. So for these and many reasons, it is a great pleasure to hear from Professor Bruno Chaouat today. So I will turn it over.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So I'm not going to use this one.
Right, you're mic'd up. We'll save you. We'll have that for discussion.
Okay, you can hear anything? Or? Can you hear any? Okay, whatever.
Yes.
Okay, so I may be disappointing you because I am not going to talk about theory and Jews, and I'm not going to talk about anti-Semitism for once in my life. I want to thank Etta and Ethan and Jennifer Lipscomb, who is not here, I believe, and Suzanne for your very generous invitation and for the work you've done to organize this. The title of my talk today is Withstanding Reason, Lev Shestov and Emmanuel Levinas Before the Catastrophe. So what I'm going to try to present today are the first faltering steps of a work in progress on the influence of Russian émigré on French anti-rational thought. The dialogue between French thought and late 19th century and early 20th century Russian existential philosophy is less known than the German lineage, notably Nietzsche and Heidegger. Hence my wish to explore the Russian connection. So in the following, you will hear me struggling, very genuinely, I hope, with paradoxical ideas that do not pertain to philosophy as commonly understood. Shestov and Levinas' paradoxes, indeed, invite us to imagine a place beyond being and to turn away from logos. Now, if philosophy since Plato aspired to account for the general, for the one, for the universal, then both Shestov and Levinas turned away from the original task of philosophy. Existential or concrete philosophy, I will suggest, demands that one suspend the domination of the concept and that one heed the affect, the voice of despair and hope that calls in the wilderness. A word on my title. I used the preposition before in both spatial and temporal senses. Shestov, Levinas, both write after the Great War, and for Shestov, before the Holocaust. Both arguably respond to the Great War and to the destruction of the human face that ensued. But before the catastrophe also points to what is in front of us, what confronts us in a not so distant future. Finally, for Shestov's works, I have used Boris de Schlosser's French official translation with occasional modifications based on the Russian original. Now, of particular interest to me, beyond the philological and historical inquiry, is the relevance of some of the questions formulated in the interwar and post-war period to our distressing time. And yet no thinker seems further removed from our current concerns than Yehuda Leib Schwarzman, aka Lev Shestov, the Russian Jewish émigré who, in the 1920s and 30s, bewildered the Parisian elite with his untimely work. But it's perhaps his untimeliness that makes Shestov our contemporary. Humanity is confronted with what seems to be an inevitable process of self-destruction, a process which philosopher Anselm Japp recently called autophagia. ongoing climate catastrophe, New World Order, nuclear threat, pandemics, and finally the replacement of cognitive work by artificial intelligence. Some techno-prophets call for the immigration of humanity into space, while some postmodern theorists promote transhuman morphing or cyber hybridization. This is called techno-solutionism, powerless with regard to the problems created by technology. We are urged to find the solution in it. All problems are said to be soluble in technoscience. If indefinite development and growth lead us to destruction, more development and growth will save us, of course. Such is the implacable logic of modernity. It is the logic of the ananke, the necessity, the inevitable progress and so-called end of history. So on the infernal asymptote, how do you say that, asymptote, that bring us closer to the catastrophe, we can turn to the thinkers of the Frankfurt School, Walter Benjamin, of course, Horkheimer, Adorno, Arendt, or Günther Anders. But I also think that Shestov's anti-philosophy opens up an original path of thinking about what awaits us. In a very different way, as we shall see, Levinas' critique of ontology and philosophies of totality from the 1930s onwards finds an echo at a time when a rethinking of the Enlightenment in the age of environmental crisis is, I think, becoming urgent. And yet, we must ask ourselves whether we really need enemies of reason, misologists, as Shestov called himself, in a time of conspiracy theories and post-truth and unprecedented assault on science. With his stubborn condemnation of reason and universal principles, is not Shestov more of a pariah today than he ever was? Unless it is reason itself that led us on the path to nihilism. In my conclusion, I will suggest reading Shestov's Trial of Philosophy in light of the history of nihilism, proposed by a contemporary philosopher named Jean Viaulac. For Viaulac, nihilism begins in the Greek idealist denial of concrete life and ends in the wasteland of the Anthropocene. As for Levinas, while he attempted to imagine a common world in the wake of the Second World War, it was never for him in the celebration of the absurd, but in ethics and the interhuman, what he has called also socialité. Levinas' philosophy indicates a possibility of rethinking humanism through the prism of the catastrophe against totality, but I would argue never against reason. Levinas went even so far at some point as to celebrate the miracles of technology in the areas of medicine and even space exploration, mainly against Heidegger's idolatry of roots and fantasy of authenticity. So if, as Jean Viaulac suggests, reason leads to destruction, we must ask ourselves whether a radical critique of reason does not in turn risk promoting another form of nihilism, namely a dubious celebration of the irrational. Walter Benjamin bluntly said of Shestov that his philosophy had little practical application and was quite simply useless. An anti-Marxist, Shestov was indeed anything but a philosopher of praxis. He was, as Levinas put it, an open wound, which is hardly conducive to action and political commitment. In 1937, 1 year before Shestov's death, Levinas published a review of his book on Kierkegaard and discussed the reasons for the renewed interest in the Danish thinker in Europe in the interwar period. Levinas was much less severe in his review than Walter Benjamin, and he clearly related to Shestov's despair. And I quote Levinas: "The moral crisis unleashed by the 1914 war gave people a keen sense of the ineffectiveness of reason. of the fundamental disagreements between rationalist civilization and the demands of the individual soul lost in the anonymity of the general, end quote. In his assessment, and on the eve of the other moral demise of the century, Levinas appears to be in agreement with Shestov's diagnosis. By the way, Freud had made a very similar observation some 20 years earlier. The First World War dealt a final blow to civilization and discredited the Western promise of indefinite progress. The irrationalist movement, especially in France, can be interpreted as a response to the collapse of a morality based on reason, or rather of reason as the sole foundation of morality. Shestov gets very close to Freud when he wrote in 1919, and I quote Shestov, "Modern culture was supposed to reunite all of humanity and establish heaven on earth. And heaven would have been realized if all of a sudden an incomprehensible madness had not shattered the minds and pushed men to destroy with a rage never witnessed in history the fruit of age-old efforts and labor," end quote. Total war, grounded in total mobilization, also saw the first occurrence of anonymous mass death. And it is no coincidence that it was at the end of the war that tribute was paid to the so-called unknown soldiers, soldats inconnus. The ordeal of the Great War mutilated the face of man, brutalized Western humanity, and paved the way for fascism and totalitarianism. Jean Violac, in the first volume of his 2023 Métaphysique de l'Anthropocène, writes, it's a book about World War I and much more than that, but he writes, "The war front is the event of a collapse of the world, of a reduction to nothingness of all things, and of a questioning of all meaning, a demystification that sweeps away all the impostures and pretenses of civilization," end quote. So this collapse of the world and the experience of absurd destruction are artfully illustrated, of course, by many writers, but one of them is the most famous and notorious Louis Ferdinand Céline in his 1932 Voyage au bout de la nuit. Existential thought in France, particularly the major themes of anxiety and the absurd, is the child of the Great War and of what Levinas calls in his Cahier de Captivité the broken world, le monde cassé. In the introduction of his book, The Power of the Keys, Potestas Clavium, written in 1919, Shestov wrote in a tone reminiscent of the prophets of Israel, and I quote Shestov, "If the horrors of recent years have knocked our presumptuous self-assurance, the misfortunes and sufferings that have collapsed on our heads will have been of some use. But it is unlikely that this will happen. We must believe that man, this perpetual Sisyphus, will once again set about patiently rolling the immense rock of history and will strive, as in the past, to haul it up in torment to the top of the mountain until the next catastrophe, until all the misfortunes we have witnessed are repeated once again. The philosophy of history does not at all resemble the description Hegel gave us with such inviolable assurance and such heavy carelessness. Humanity does not live in the light, but in the midst of darkness, plunged into a perpetual night, no, into 1,001 nights. And history will never bring man into the light." That's super optimistic for the end of the semester. I'm sorry. But I mean, end quote. "The catastrophe has eclipsed the sun of reason. Does this mean that one should condemn reason for having betrayed humanity? But Shestov tells us the true betrayal of humanity, the real violence against concrete life, is to deny the absence of meaning." And I quote Shestov, "To understand the war, one must tell oneself that it has no meaning at all, that it's a blatant absurdity," end quote. In other words, a true understanding of the catastrophe requires a suspension of reason and a recognition that some accidents of history cannot be recuperated, in Hegelian parlance, sublated. Suffering has no meaning, no purpose, no use, despite the claims of the antique wisdom, insofar as suffering is always singular and a fact of concrete existence. This is why Shestov opted for existential thought and for literature, for the particular and the concrete, against what he calls the general. On Shestov's invitation to heed the particular, allow me a personal anecdote. When I was in college at age 17 or so, the most promising student of our cohort specialized in philosophy and, before converting to Leibniz's theodicy, was a staunch Marxist with a Kantian sensitivity, Kant mainly for the Teutonic rigidity. I recall a conversation I had with him in which I candidly asked what he would do to me on the day of the revolution. Nietzsche had saved me from communism at the time, and I was no longer on board for picking a fight with the bourgeoisie. So he replied with the coldness of those who believe in what Albert Camus called le crime logique, and I quote him, "I would have to kill you," end quote. I think that this may constitute the primal scene of my political or anti-political consciousness, and perhaps the reason why I always stood with literature, the particular, against speculative and then materialist philosophy, the general. So the shock of the Great War was met with wild responses from movements in philosophy and in the arts. In France, we need only think of the tremors of surrealism, but also the extreme experiments of the Collège de Sociologie to measure the crisis that culture and thought went through in this interwar period. In this respect, I will mention that Shestov was the mentor of none other than Georges Bataille, who translated his essay on Tolstoy and Nietzsche from Russian. Admittedly, Bataille's thought would distance itself from that of his Russian mentor. Sacrifice, the notion of expenditure, celebration of death do not stand out as Shestovian themes. The fact remains that in the 1930s, Levinas was, I think, right to warn against the threat that irrationalism represents, even though Shestov was not directly concerned. And I quote one line by Levinas' 1937 essay on Shestov. I quote, "Hence, in different forms, the renewal of both irrationalism and doctrines of violence," end quote. And for those who are familiar a little bit with Georges Bataille, Bataille wrote in the 1930s in an extraordinary text called The Psychological Structure of Fascism, in which we see how Bataille is tempted and repelled at the same time by fascism and Nazism. So the extraordinary text, actually. Fascism and totalitarianism, in fact, prolonged the catastrophe of the Great War, since they already found a cultural expression in futurist nihilism, its promotion of death and machines, and its aestheticization of politics. Levinas was very early on aware of the risk that anti-rationalism represented in the field of thought, but also and above all in the political field. But far from neo-pagan outbursts and from Bataille's erotics, for Shestov, it is nonetheless necessary to leave the general and rediscover the particular experience. The word expérience intérieure comes actually from Shestov. This is what I discovered. I have to still refine this and do more work on that. But this is an expression I found literally in Shestov, and it informed and was used by Georges Bataille as a major concept in his very strange kind of existentialism or concrete philosophy. So it's nonetheless necessary to leave the general and rediscover the particular experience, the incommensurability of the affect, and the untranslatability of pathos. In Tolstoy's famous short story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, we find a heart-rending illustration of the violence of what Shestov calls the general. And now I quote, of course, famous line from Tolstoy. "Caius is a man. Men are mortal. Caius is mortal," end quote. That is what the young Ivan Illich was expected to learn in school. But when confronted 30 years later with his absurd pain and his inevitable death, the syllogism is of no help to him. In the face of adversity, general reasoning proves nothing. Caius is mortal, says Ivan Illich, that's for sure, and it's natural that he should die. But me, Vanya, Ivan Illich, with all my feelings, my intelligence, me, that's something else. It's not at all natural that I should die. It would be too awful, end quote. The general, that is to say the laws of reason, what Shestov calls speculative philosophy and that he opposes to life, the general can hardly relieve Ivan Illich from the pangs of the inevitable. On the contrary, Vanya rebels against necessity. It's precisely this rebellion, metaphysical if there ever was one, that Shestov discovers in Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Ivan Illich, and Kierkegaard. He wages his battle against the tyranny of ananke, the necessity, the constraint that he finds in Aristotle's philosophy. What is. What was. Impassive, indifferent, being is tautological. Even God, Hellenized by medieval theology and by the Catholic Church, must submit to the constraints of reason. Every unique one must be absorbed by the great one, each singularity subsumed by the general. From then on, philosophy, from Athens to Hegel, apathetic, avoids thinking about the scandal of suffering and death. This is why, in the wake of Kierkegaard, Shestov developed an anti-philosophy, which he also called misology, rejection of logos. Thus, Levinas notes in his 1937 commentary on Shestov, and I quote Levinas again, "In a world enlightened and explained by reason, only the general counts. My own destiny is not important. My own pain is not exceptional. My own despair is nothing unique. If I carry a sadness or shame deep in my soul, it does not disturb the universal order. My speculation assigns this phenomenal place in the whole, and my wisdom can only consist of submitting to its laws," end quote. With concision here, Levinas summarized Shestov's rebellion, which was also that of Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, and Ivan Illich. Speculative philosophy has nothing to say about life. Absurd, life cannot be reduced to those general laws. Existence does not fit in the categories of logic because life always exceeds philosophical categories. It is for that reason that Shestov turned to literature and existential philosophy, the only forms of speech capable of bearing witness to the idiocy of pain and to the scandal of evil. The contemporary philosopher Clément Rosset spoke of the idiocy du réel. Indeed, reality cannot be dubbed or duplicated into the rational, that is to say, the general. The idiotic irreducibility of the real prevents it from being inscribed in a sequence of causes and effects and subsumed under the law of necessity and the inevitable. The Hellenization of revelation, which has submitted God to reason, bears the name of, for Shestov, bears the name of Hegel and the philosophy of history. Aspiring to universal domination, reason hates life and is unable, says Shestov, to create life. Hegelian philosophy is dead because man is a mere step in the history of the spirit, and in the spirit, man is already transcended or sublated. Shestov sees in the domination of reason and the universal the sacrifice of concrete life on the altar of idealism. Hence, his rebellion against all forms of justifications of evil. Hence also why he sees speculative philosophy as the graveyard of concrete existence. In sum, Shestov's voice calls in the wilderness of modern nihilism. But at the same time, we should not limit Shestov's condemnation of reason to modernity. Instead, he sees modernity as the mere accomplishment of 2,000 years of a metaphysics for which wisdom consists in accepting and justifying fate and evil. I have suggested that the Shestovian rumination is marked by the atrocities of modern history, notably the pogroms and the Russian revolutions. Shestov's moved to France just after the loss of his son in the Great War. His rumination reads like a long ostinato in which thought does not progress linearly but elliptically and fragmentarily. It digs a furrow, returns to it tenaciously, stringing together paradoxical propositions, often indulging in the absurd. For anyone who wants to read Shestov, I'm not sure that I will convince you to read him, but if you open any book by Shestov, and there are many books by him and many, many pages, lots of pages by Shestov, and you open anywhere, you're going to say, well, I've read that before. Why does he repeat himself? He does not self-plagiarize, but he is obsessed with the same idea, That is, how can we beat? How can we rebel against necessity, against the inevitable? That's what comes up and up and up. So, okay. So to the horrors of his personal history and the tragedy of history, Shestov responds with this absurd proposition that time is reversible. To imperius fatum, he opposes the possibility of the impossible. And the impossible lies in the paradox that what has happened can be revoked. As if one could rewind the thread of time, and the film of history. All of Shestov's work reject the idea of eternal recurrence and Nietzsche's amor fati. Odium fati, the horror, the hatred of what has been, was Shestov's response to the catastrophe of modernity. Whereas Nietzsche's Zarathustra willed the eternal recurrence of everything that has been, Shestov sought to undo what was. A great admirer of Nietzsche, to whom, by the way, he partially dedicated 2 books, he could not follow him in his exaltation of necessity. Nietzsche, he laments, betrayed his great rebellion against philosophy by yielding to the tyranny of destiny, that is to say, to the Greek wisdom. And I quote Shestov, Nietzsche himself ended up glorifying amor fati. Supreme wisdom consists in loving the inevitable, end quote. As Shestov scholar Ramona Fotiade notes, there are some Rimbaldian echoes or overtones in Shestov rebellions against the scandal of the inevitable. Non, non, maintenant, je me révolte contre la mort. It's a poem by Rimbaud. One must therefore reject Athens' wisdom and refuse philosophical submission to fate. The truly free man can reverse time through the power of faith, or rather, since nothing is impossible to God, since only God is bound to the impossible, only faith can interrupt necessity. Reversing the course of time, withstanding the unfolding of history, pure nonsense, the rationalist philosopher from Plato to Hegel and Husserl even would answer. But for Shestov, the logical and chronological sequence binds man to the laws of reason. Faith suspends this sequence by presenting itself as a suspension, an epoche of knowledge, ethics, and reason. And a suspension of time, a derangement of chronology, one big line that inspires Shestov throughout his life work is Shakespeare, time is out of joint, which, by the way, you find echoes in Derrida and, of course, Levinas as well. A sort of bizarre line, which I've never understood, in fact, but is this idea of a derangement of time. The laws of reason, Leibniz theodicy or Hegel historiodicee, and even Husserl's return to Descartes do not provide answers. The world, as Camus writes in the myth of Sisyphus, is silent. And I quote Albert Camus, who quotes Shestov and engages with Shestov in the myth de Sisyphe. It is against, I quote Camus, the absurd arises from this confrontation between the call of man and the unreasonable silence of the world, end quote. It is against the silence of the world that man rebels. He refuses to justify this idiotic reality, to make it part of the intelligence that believes it can comprehend everything, submit everything to the general. But is idiocy a response to historical evil? The rebellion against being is familiar to the reader of Emmanuel Levinas, of course. From the 1930s onwards, Levinas purported to dethrone ontology and crown ethics as first philosophy. And Levinas also purported to turn away from logos. But for him, it was never a question of replacing reason and knowledge with faith, but of subjecting philosophy to ethics. That is to say, to the thought of the face and of the infinite. The encounter with the other cannot be comprehended in general laws for Levinas. It disrupts reason and speculative philosophy. The infinite pierces through, punctures totality. A little bit when I was thinking about this, I was thinking of Roland Barthes' punctum that breaks through the studium in a photograph. There is something of the infinite that pierces through the totality. For obvious chronological reasons, Levinas' rebellion against being is rooted in the interwar context and the immediate after war, whereas for Shestov, the decisive event was the Great War. Furthermore, Levinas was engaged with and against Heidegger's thought, which, despite the break it represented in the metaphysical tradition, never succeeded in overcoming being. Note that Heidegger's thought was itself a rebellion against logic, against reason, to which Heidegger preferred the quasi-mystical experience of being as such and the recovery of pagan rootedness. For Levinas, Heidegger's ontology ignores and always ignored the other, and being toward death represents an ultimate self-appropriation and self-authentication, which Levinas critiqued. Suffice it to say that Levinas attributes evil to the reduction of the world to being, to totality. The human world in his philosophy is always more than being, more than what he calls the there is, or il y a. In order to become a place of dwelling for the human, a home, we need a particular, a singular being, what he calls an existant. The Levinasian being, the existant, you and me, if you prefer, or what Sartre calls la réalité humaine, for example, and of course Heidegger the Dasein, the existant also rebels against the naked fact of the there is, or the il y a. Levinas suggests that man should never be content with the neutrality of being. And at this juncture, it is worth noting that Shestov had identified what he deemed the very foundation of Western metaphysics in a fragment by a pre-Socratic philosopher, Anaximander. This fragment suggests that by coming into existence, by separating themselves from the primitive and the divine unity, the boundless or the apeiron, to descend into finite particular being, all things must expiate and suffer death and destruction. The problem then is when existence, the one, turns into existant, that is, beings with a little b. For Shestov, Western metaphysics rests on the condemnation of this loss of unity and of the hypostasis of the particular being, be it a camel, man, or stone. So you see how Shestov, with Levinas, together with Levinas, are on the side, doesn't make much sense to say that this way, but are trying to speak on behalf of the particular being against this boundless apeiron, or this big ilia that Levinas calls ilia, which is a very bizarre concept, which would take a long time to try to unpack, but I can try to respond later. All right, so for Levinas, evil lies in the satiated contentment in being, best encapsulated in Spinoza's conatus, striving to persevere in one's own being. Levinas sees the conatus as an ethics for trees and for vegetables, but not for humans. As for the good, it is found only in the encounter with the other person, not in the contemplation of being or in the night of the Iliad, not in the beauty of nature, but in what he called thinking of the other, the pensée à l'autre, not in the being toward death, but in being for the other, to wit and to use Levinas' phrase, in otherwise than being, autrement qu'être. As with Shestov, therefore, pure being must be shattered by lived experience. Shestov's scholar James McLachlan noted in an article on Levinas and the Russian existentialist, and I quote, "It is this rebellion that Levinas appreciates in Shestov. He rebels against acceptance of the horrors of the world to which we might sacrifice all we love as the ultimate barbarism." Ontology for Levinas leads to barbarity because it reduces the other to the same and justifies that which is in its tautology. And note that Levinas does not fault reason, but being, aware as he is that after the two world wars, irrational and mythical forces have led to barbarity. So there is absolutely no rejection of reason for Levinas. But there is a serious critique of being at this kind of non-particular general existence. So I have, how much time do I have left? I want to, because, how much longer? 15 minutes, is it good? 10 minutes?
10, 15 minutes.
10, oh yeah, 10, okay. Well, I'm going to conclude because I committed to gauge the legacy of Shestov and Levinas for us today. And I will close on sketching some new developments in the critique of reason and ontology. Some recent reflections suggest that the domination of reason has led to the forgetting of the other, whether this other is the other man or living beings in general. If Levinas did not extend his ethics to other forms of life, some contemporary philosophers today reclaim his legacy to warn about the catastrophe in progress. I'm thinking mainly on one I'm not engaged directly for this purpose. She's called Corinne Peluchon. She has a great book in which she uses a lot of Levinas in order to try to reclaim the legacy of the Enlightenment, but in the age of what she calls l'âge du vivant, in the age of the environmental crisis. A very interesting book. Actually, just came out recently. In the first volume of his Métaphysique de l'Anthropocène, which I mentioned already, Viewlak ruthlessly retraces the unfolding of metaphysics as the history of the totalization of being. The postmodern parlance notwithstanding, one can hear echoes of Shestov's rebellion against the general and of Levinas' critique of ontology. And I quote Viewlak, was published last year. Greek thought set the West on the path to the one that defined its regime of truth through ontology, that is to say, through a thought of the total fullness of being defined by the mass of a perfectly round sphere, Parmenides, the one grounded history on the idea of providence, that is to say, the pre-science, the prescience, and pre-vision of an ordering intellect that has always already ordered everything in the whole, end quote. At the dawn of European modernity, providence or theodicy, if you prefer, morphed into the becoming number of the world, le devenir nombre du monde, to quote a beautiful book by the philosopher Olivier Rey, Comment le monde devint nombre. Through the rise, among other state apparatuses, of course, statistics. More recently, theodicy has been digitized, rationalized in algorithms. Some are even predicting what Leibniz was already foreseeing and calling for, a justice system based entirely on computation. Thus, the incommensurable is reduced to the calculable, the face to pixels, and language simplified into code. Face and language are no longer, as Levinas hoped, wonder, and hospitality. Concrete life is compressed into algorithmic models, and an Ivan Illich today would call in the wilderness of the cyberspace vox clamentis in mundo virtuali. But I am Vanya. My suffering, my life, my death are not a mere matter of pixels and statistics. Since Leibniz, the real is represented as calculable and the universe as mathematizable. We know, moreover, that thought and art themselves are today threatened by calculability, since the ordering intellect, the nous of the ancients, is now called a computer, and large language models are based on probabilities. Viewlac further suggests that we cannot think the coming catastrophe insofar as all negativity is necessarily sublated into positivity. Metaphysics, he adds, never takes death seriously, end quote. Now, as Shestov had argued a century ago, Hegelian history, which he also calls the no-ODC, that is the justice of the mind, or the unfolding of the spirit, stumbles over the atrocities of history and the scandal of death. Indeed, as Viewlac notes, Hegel endeavors to rationalize destruction and to justify it through a rehabilitation of theodicy. End quote. Evil is turned into necessity in the name of the unfolding of the spirit. However, the suffering of children, as Ivan Karamazov contends, cannot be sublated in the movement of history, which is that of indifferent reason. This is where we can move from a critique of reason and totality in the Hegelian sense to an analysis of the current catastrophe. Hegel said that reason cannot waste time on the wounds inflicted on individuals because the particular ends are dissolved in the universal end. End quote. Like the concept, the universal is abstract, even though Hegel attempted to construct some kind of dialectic concrete universal. Hegel's death becomes a concept rather than a singular event. The metaphysical rebellion from Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky to Shestov was rebelling precisely against the generality of the concept. The destruction of life on earth is not a concept, but a very concrete reality. And yet, anti-rational thought, if it is even possible to think without reason, may lead us to another form of nihilism that I think Levinas has avoided, the nihilism of radical metaphysical rebellion. Thank you so much. I hope I did not went. So let me take yes. So I'm happy, of course, to take questions, but just be aware that this is really work in progress. I'm not sure that not everything is tied, and there are many loose ends. So if you can help me in my work, that would be wonderful. If you can't and have questions, and I would be happy to try to comment or answer or reflect with you. Oh, thank you so much. So I don't know if, yes, please.
It's sort of a basic question.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This may be sort of a basic question, but I guess in terms of since you're it's a work in progress and you're thinking about how to maybe frame it in a tighter way, I'm wondering if you feel like you have a typology of thought regarding catastrophe in, say, from the interwar to the post-war era that you feel like is represented by Levinas on one hand and Shestov on the other hand. Maybe not, but I feel like for me as a non-philosopher, very interested in the topic and these thinkers, that it would be helpful to understand if you feel like they form two typologies, or they partially are part of one typology, just to sort of kind of spell that out more.
Yeah. Do you want to ask another question, or do you want me to try to engage now? I mean, it's not like I don't really have an answer. I mean, it's catastrophe. When we say catastrophe, I immediately think of Walter Benjamin because he's really the thinker of catastrophe in many ways, and I would have to engage more with Walter Benjamin and his thesis on history in particular. So I think this would be very important also in the context of the interwar period and what was to come for Walter Benjamin and what came after World War I. I'm also very infused with the literature of World War I, particularly The Voyage au bout de la nuit, Céline, which is also a book about catastrophe and the catastrophe to come, and his own, existential catastrophe of anti-Semitism and Nazism. So when it comes to Levinas has been always kind of clear that he wrote in the wake of the catastrophe, that he wrote in order to try to rebuild the world that has been broken, not by metaphysics, because he does not attack metaphysics like Violac does, for example. He doesn't say metaphysics, quite the opposite. I mean, he reclaims metaphysics, of course, but not the metaphysics of totality or the metaphysics of the one and totality. So he is trying to rebuild, in the wake of catastrophe, a world and an ethics. And I think that Shestov is much more of a witness, and I would say almost a witness survivor of the catastrophe than Levinas. Levinas is not a witness. He's really elaborating a philosophy, a coherent one. Shestov is not. Shestov, he says, I am the vox clamantis in deserto. He is basically, you can call him a pamphlétaire, to a certain extent. I mean, there is an aspect of the pamphlet, in this kind of ressassement, interminable ressassement of the same thing all the time, page after page, in Russian, so imagine. So it's bizarre. And he is really obsessing. I mean, Levinas also has his own obsession. I mean, if you read Levinas, you also realize you can open the page by Levinas anywhere in his work, and you will find pretty much things that are very much similar. And always, and how this, the infinite pierces through totality, etc. It's always the same type of thing. But I would say that Levinas is more of a thinker's philosopher, and I would say that Shestov is some kind of witness of these atrocities. And there is something prophetic that, of course, you could also find in Levinas to a certain extent, but very differently. There is something much more Slavic in Shestov, despite the fact that Levinas was super influenced by Russian literature. There is something much more Germanic in Levinas that you do not have in Shestov. Shestov is really Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. So I was rereading Tolstoy Confession. I don't know if anyone knows this unbelievable text. And it's all about that. I mean, this is the foundation of existential thinking, basically. The foundation of existential thinking is in Dostoevsky and Shestov, Kierkegaard, of course. But it's this idea that what about that I'm going to die? What about that I exist? These are fundamental questions that have informed existential philosophy. Of course, Heidegger, in his own way, has asked nothing but this question. That is the question of metaphysics, is this question of Heidegger, that there are beings rather than none, which is also a Leibniz question, by the way. So I don't know, it's not an answer, but it's just, So,
I mean, for those of us who are not philosophers, even that, some of that framing is, I think, helps to set up the question.
But you would have to add thinkers like Hans Jonas. Right. You would have to add very contemporary thinkers who are today reflecting about the situation of catastrophe. Like Jean Violac I think he's not known. Probably no one has read him or heard of him, but he publishes with the Presse Universitaire de France. He published 2 enormous volumes called Métaphysique de l'Anthropocène. Anthropocene is kind of a polemical word, which I think everyone knows. Anthropocene is the same, right? Everybody has heard the word Anthropocene. Is the idea that we have, reached an age of in which we have so much impacted, if you will, our environment, that the environment is now entirely human, made, so to speak, or and has become more and more and more inhospitable. So it is, at first, I think it was meant to be a polemical term. It has been that some geologists have tried to use this word. It was not very very successful. I think Viewlak uses it in a very interesting way because he's really retracing a whole history of the metaphysics that leads to the moment we are in. I'm not going to summarize him. It's 700 pages of very dense writing. But I do recommend, because the first one is called, the second of his 2 volumes is called Raison et Destruction, and there is really this idea that reason, a certain kind of reason, and of course I don't know what's called rationalité instrumentale, that you can imagine, a critique of reason within the realm of reason, which I think is the only possibility that we have. I don't think we have any other possibility. I don't think that Shestov way is the way at all. I mean, it's a scream, it's a call, but that's about it. It's performative, so it says something. It is very, very performative. Levinas is not performative. Levinas is, in a way, in his own way, speculative. He's a speculative philosopher. Any other, maybe?
I feel that you might have a question. No? Oh, and excuse me.
Oh, sure.
Thank you so much. That was full, a very, very full presentation, and so many references to try to reconstruct even some of what you thought. What was the word earlier? Yasankov? Okay. I couldn't tell if it was a Russian word, French word, or a Hebrew word. And I think it was...
Yasankov?
Yeah. What, did anybody else hear a word they didn't recognize at all? Sort of in the first,
Well, with my pronunciation too is not necessarily... Ananke.
Oh, no. Ananke. Oh, okay.
It's the necessity, it's the Greek, right? I mean, you would know more than I do because of tragedy. Ananke, it's used. I think it's used by Aristotle in Poetics. I think but not only. I mean, but I think it means like the constraints, basically, that there is absolutely no reversibility, that the fate is there. So this idea of reversibility of time, I absolutely don't understand. By the way, it's not like I'm saying things that I understand, and that's the point of Shestov, is that you are not really supposed to understand. That's what I'm saying. There is a performative work in many ways. And you understand me, I can summarize Shestov, but I don't get it. I don't get the idea of the time can be. So he has a couple of, quotations here and there about how you can remiss or remit, the time in the Bible, of course, like Job, for example, he gets his children back. It's not the same children, but he gets, his family back after he was taken. So there's a kind of reversibility of time. You can imagine that Abraham will get Isaac again because he gave, and then, there is a sort of reversibility. It's not metanoia. It's something different from that. It's something I'm sorry, go. You wanted to add something?
Well, I have not heard of this writer at all.
Oh.
And I wonder what in his early life?
Yeah.
What was?
Yeah. So a Jewish comes from a Jewish Orthodox family in Russia. Yeah, and he is living in Switzerland a lot. He's living abroad in Europe a lot, but back to Russia all the time. His thought is completely infused with Orthodox Christianity, very clearly. In many ways, he's kind of de-Judaized. But not completely, because although he reads the Bible in Russian and not in Hebrew, despite the fact that all his family was, reading everything in Hebrew, he reads Gospels, of course, he reads in Greek and everything else in Latin. So he's a sort of like prodigy, like an erudite, and because he's read the Germans, he's read Kierkegaard, not in Danish, but he's read Kierkegaard very well. His main influences, nonetheless, are really, I think, the Russian Slavophile, almost Slavophile kind of influence. I would say Dostoevsky is the big, Underground Man in particular. Because Underground Man is like, the wall of evidence, right? So I always, you remember the L'Homme du Souterrain? How do you say in English? The Underground Man? The Underground Man. It's a novel by Dostoevsky or this guy who says, I'm ugly, I'm mean, that's how he starts. Les carnets du sous-sol. Yeah, les carnets du sous-sol, les carnets du sous-sol in French and whatever. And he's, he's kind of like a very bizarre figure of ressentiment, and you don't. And he is also a philosopher in his own way, and he is a philosopher of existence and of concrete existence. He says, I do not want to abide by the laws of mathematics. I do not want to abide by the laws of, because it's not my life. My life is. It's exactly what Tolstoy says in Confession. Exactly the same thing. Tolstoy in the 1880s, I think, when he writes Confession, he says exactly the same thing. I cannot, I've learned mathematics, I've learned this, but it doesn't answer my existential question. Yes, please.
I love that you're so passionately committed to the particularity of literature, and I was thinking about you mentioned Salim, reading that as a kind of mesmerizing experience.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about Shestov as a writer, something about his, I don't know what languages you've read him in, even in translation.
Yeah.
Partially because you described him more as you said, a thinker. Is there something powerful in the...
Yeah, some Russian critics call him one of the best stylists in the Russian language. I read him in French mainly, in English, and I have the original Russian with me, and I go to it now and then, especially for certain concepts, like the general and the particular. Those words are very important because then he uses it in very different contexts, and you can realize that there is a coherence in the way he uses it. He uses it in very... When I was the fragment by Anaximander, I was quoting, for example, Anaximander talks about the boundless, the apeiron in Greek, which is the no limit, the limitless, right? The absence of limit, and that existence, so to speak, as such, being as such, from where comes some beings, and we expiate by death our descent into concrete life. It's a digression, but I'll go back to you. And then he uses the same word as when he uses about Vanya being a particular person. And so the word he uses in Russian is общий. Общий means the general, and часть means a part, a little part. And we are часть. We are a little part. We are existant, in the sense of beings, if you will. We are particulars, right? And as opposed to this общий, which is the general, which is actually sort of stifles us in many ways, in the same way as the Ilia for Levinas. There are some articles that actually compare the Ilia and the general. Anyway, but his style is, it's hard for me to tell if he's a great stylist. I could not really say, he's a great stylist, because I would have to really to compare with, other... what I say is that it is, how do you say in English? Entêtant. Entêtant. C'est entêtant. It is stubborn, yeah. It's obstinate. It is, that's why I was talking about ostinato, because it's obstinate. It's an obstinate style that, as I said, it digs a furrow, it goes back to it, like in some kind of almost a boustrophédon type of writing, like Sillon, like this. It goes back and it goes again, and it's almost like you don't really progress. There is no real progress at all in here. There is not an argument, right? So, sorry, it doesn't respond to your question of style, but I cannot detach it from the substance, because they are completely intricate, right?
Can I go to the obvious conclusion here that style reflects his resistance to whole?
Yeah. So it's what Boris Blanchot called l'écriture fragmentaire, the fragmentary writing. So it's a complete resistance to totalization. It's an attempt at resisting totalization through this kind of bizarre. There is a beautiful essay by what's his name, the poet Yves Bonnefoy, a very beautiful essay by Yves Bonnefoy on Shestov called L'obstination de Shestov. And it's obstinate, because it's childish. It's like a child who is obstinate with an idea, right? You cannot tell him, stop telling this stupid thing that the time can be reversed. Stop saying those absurdities, okay? It makes no sense. And he writes and writes. And he is applauded in Paris in 1920s. He becomes, the mentor of Georges Bataille. And I do believe that he has an influence on the anti-rational French thought. Levinas writes about him, not much, but he does engage with him. Bataille translates his book on Tolstoy and the idea of the good, Tolstoy and the idée du bien. And you can see a sort of Bataille in mirror, because Bataille is about evil, and the Tolstoy in the idea of the good, and you can see some echoes which are super interesting, because you would not expect to find in Berdyaev, who is another Russian émigré, by the way, and in Shestov, some French stuff, right? So there's a whole French connection that I'm interested in. I don't know if he will go anywhere, but anyway.
I think we need Anne Smock here. I don't know if you know Anne Smock.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Oh, yeah.
No, I was just thinking because
The Blanchot,
yeah,
Blanchot,
that's right.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Maybe it's strange, I was thinking of Celan while you were talking.
Yeah. So this I don't. No, but Celan, the lineage would be Heidegger for Celan. It would really be Heidegger. And Shestov has read Heidegger. Chronologically, it works, actually. So he has read Heidegger. He talks about Heidegger. Another figure who is a very enigmatic figure in the French émigré world is Benjamin Fondan, who was also Jewish but Romanian. And Fondan became the disciple of Shestov in France. And Fondan was an extraordinary figure. He wrote on Rimbaud. He was a polygraph. He didn't write that much, but he wrote on many very eclectic topics. He has a book on Rimbaud le Voyou, and he has a remarkable book on Shestov, and he has a book called La Conscience Malheureuse, which is basically a digest, an indigest digest, but it's a digest nonetheless, of Shestov thought. And it's mainly about the opposition between Athens and Jerusalem. So, as you may have understood, Shestov magnum opus is Athens and Jerusalem. I didn't even mention it, but you can see it when you read. It's Athens and Jerusalem, and it's basically the polarity between reason and revelation, and Shestov standing completely undialectically. That's the thing too, which Levinas doesn't do ever. He's always very, very dialectical when it comes to Athens and Jerusalem, when it comes to the Greeks and to and to the Bible and the prophets and so on, and Athens and Jerusalem. And so Benjamin Fondan is this Benjamin Fondan is killed, is murdered in Auschwitz, and he is a very tragic figure who wrote a great book and many articles trying to popularize Shestov, his mentor, thought.
I was just,
of
you
course,
said the word dialectic, and I've been wondering about it, not to get too abstract, but I was just wondering exactly that question about, two parts, I guess, was three to my question. One is, I was wondering if all the generals are the same, right? Because we're opposing the general to the specific, and so the general and the philosophical to literature and the life, so the computer system.
Yeah.
I guess, okay, again, not to reveal the Enlightenment part of me, but for someone like Rousseau, right, there are so many different generals. So like the political general is completely different from the economic general, right? So the political would be one that recognized specificity and individuality, whereas the economic is what you would want to reject because that's the mathematics, the totalization that erases, effaces difference, something like that. So I was wondering about that, but I was wondering too, if, I think you just started to answer that, if there is a kind of will to create a dialectic that would overcome these oppositions?
No, absolutely zero. Shestov is really a thinker of tension, but no resolution. There is zero resolution in Shestov. He is a thinker of provocation and of perpetual. C'est une écriture tendue, extremely tense kind of writing, and there is no attempt at pacification between Athens and Jerusalem, between general and the particular. He stands with the particular, despite he's not an idiot, right? He is a very brilliant man. He knows that he is wrong in many ways, but that's the act of faith, right? He knows that imagining that what has been can be undone doesn't make any sense from the perspective of reason. But that's where, and at the same time, he's a man who said all his life that il n'arrive pas à avoir la foi. So, at the same time, he can't really find faith, but all his books are about this oddity.
But is it that, in a way, that dialectic that you're talking about, that sublation is something, it's just another name for destruction.
Yeah.
For what?
For destruction.
Destruction.
Absolutely. For him, absolutely. I mean, if you have a sublation, it means that you are basically, you are already in the philosophy of death. You are already in the philosophy to the extent that philosophy is always the philosophy, especially speculative philosophy is always philosophy of death, for him. Right? That is philosophy of ideas. So you sublate the particular into ideas. So it goes from, for him, it goes from Plato. Quite different for Levinas, right? Because for Levinas, Plato is the one who said that there is something higher than everything, and it's than being, and something higher than being, and it's the good. And so Levinas likes to quote that. But those people, you can't really trust those people when they quote. I mean, they quote always very, very rigorously. So you can go and check the Greek or the Latin, and it will be. I'm not talking of Levinas, but I'm talking Shestov. He quotes in all. He writes in many languages. Anyway, and there are some. So he goes to the Greek. Yes, you can check. Yeah, but the way he interprets the thing is completely crazy, and he would make a specialist of the Bible, or of Anaximander or Parmenides jump on their chair because it doesn't make sense for them the way so he brings all of that to his obsession, right? It's an obsidional writing.
I just wondered about what would it look like, maybe you already have something that does look like, to think about them more as specifically Jewish thinkers.
Yeah.
In the case of Shestov, okay, so really, I'm walking into this lecture today, it's fascinating, but I didn't know anything about Shestov before, so what I'm saying is just from what I'm hearing from you, but, I mean, it seems to me it's very interesting that he, I don't say he converted to Orthodox Christianity, where he sort of, was overtaken by it in sort of thought, but you say he grew up in an Orthodox Jewish home.
Yeah.
So I feel like he talks about turning back time.
Yeah.
So that sounds like certain things to me in terms of Jewish things,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
It sounds, first of all, like somewhat conventional ideas about messianism, right?
Yes,
Conventional
exactly.
ideas about overcoming the whole body, overcoming destruction of the temple. You're going to rebuild the third temple in one day. There's going to you're going to reverse that. It sounds like cycles of Jewish history in theological conceptions. It also sounds like God is in exile, but will return.
Absolutely.
And it sounds like you mentioned anti-rationalism in the 20s. It sounds also like Gershom Scholem talking about, in the darkest moments of the 30s, there's this anti-rationalist messianic streak in Jewish history that will break out at any moment in you or me, right?
Sabbatianism.
So I'm just wondering if
So-
that's part of what's underneath.
It's so helpful. It's great. So the problem is that I don't find yet references to that. Doesn't mean that it's not there. It is there in the back. It's obvious. Now the messianic, it's absolutely in piece that I have to explore more because all of that. There is one essay by Levinas called Réflexions sur Hitlérisme, Reflections on the Philosophy of Hitlerism, that he wrote in 1935. It's an extraordinary text. You can find it online, it's very easy, and it's 10 pages. And he wrote it just during Hitler, 34 maybe. And Levinas says something about the reversal of time. He says in all spiritualities and religions and philosophies, there is the messianic possibility of reversing time and of forgiveness as a kind of reversal of time. And he says Nazism does not have that, obviously, because in Nazism you are what you are. There is no possibility of any kind of redemption whatsoever. So the question of redemption, the question of the messianic, the question maybe also of a certain Sabbatianism, which is there in the sense that it's a call, it's a scream. There is also some form of rebellion there against the law, and actually there are moments where he rebels against the law, antinomianism, and that's there, actually. This I have found. I did not dig enough into it, and there are not many articles or books that I found at this point, at the beginning, but that really deals with Shestov's Judaism. A little bit, not that much. But you're absolutely right that he is in this moment, the Benjaminian moment of the Messianic, and it goes up to our time with Giorgio Agamben and with Derrida. Where Agamben is not Jewish, but and with Derrida, this idea of time out of joint, which is a phrase that has to do for Derrida with the Messianic, I believe, and to an extent with the time of catastrophe. The time of catastrophe is also something that Agamben has been reflecting a lot about, in the Temps qui reste in particular, on Paul. So there is some Paul, obviously, there as well. Okay, so I don't know. It does not really respond, but it's this. Yeah, it's there.
I mean, and we're trying to wrap up. So have you looked at David Roski's book Against the Apocalypse?
No, I don't think so. Against the Apocalypse?
Yeah.
Against
the Apocalypse. It's about different modes of Jewish.
Okay, I'll take a look at that.
Literature catastrophe.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's very. I mean, it's an amazing book. And
Thank you so much.
I'll have to show up, and it starts also from
Thank you.
ideas. I mean, I guess the other. I mean, the thing that I just wonder about, it's an intangible kind of thing, but it's like when people grow up sometimes in this kind of world of Orthodox Judaism or other kinds of traditional world, the frames that are automatic for them in that environment will shape the way they apprehend all kinds of things in the world thereafter. A good illustration of that is like Isaac Bashevis Singer has this childhood memoir, A Day of Pleasure, where you see the world through his eyes. You see the world through the eyes of a child who grew up in what was, among other things, like his house was a rabbinic court because his father was a dayan, right? And so he apprehends these childhood situations immediately in terms of those sorts of traditions. So I don't know.
And also, Singer is the one who wrote on the Sabbatianism, right? Is he the one who wrote the Devil in the... where is it again? I forgot. In Gore, in this little town. I think he has a... So that's also interesting because the antinomianism is like... my last book is on Gnosticism. So antinomianism is a big thing. And so, I think it's definitely something that you can find in Shestov. So I would say yes, a rebellion against the law, against Judaism, within Judaism. I would say that's very, very probable. Yeah.
Yes. I want to ask a very quick follow-up question on that, which is, does Shestov engage at all with Rosenzweig? So obviously engage with Heidegger.
So the question is
whether he's engaging with Rosenzweig at all.
I don't, but Shestov, I do not think so. What is the chronology for Rosenzweig? Do you remember
contemporary?
When did it die? Yeah, so really contemporary. So I have not found it. No, I have not found it. I found Husserl. Husserl was actually a huge influence on Shestov, and he wrote against Husserl, but in a very, very, very loving manner, against Cartesianism, against Husserl turn to Descartes, etc., etc. So, yeah. But I didn't find Rosenzweig. I think it should be also something I need to...
So I think you hope that we read him. Do you want to recommend something in particular?
Yes. I want to recommend his very short book on Blaise Pascal called La Nuit de Gethsemane, The Night of Gethsemane. It's extremely beautiful. It's very inspired, like pretty much everything he writes, but it has the advantage of being very short and not 700 page.
Is there an audiobook? No.
The audiobook? I don't think so. I could start doing the audiobook for Shestov. But yeah, no, it's a very, very beautiful, and also he has a very beautiful essay that you can find online called Dostoevsky against the truisms, contre les évidences. So it's this fight against everything that is a truism, right? In reason, in ethics, in moral, in everything. It's a short essay on. And he's got, anyway, yeah, so.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your patience because it's a little esoteric writer, not Levinas, but.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.